His mother pushed her into an open grave in front of everyone she'd ever known, and her husband fixed his tie and looked away. They thought grief had broken her. They thought she had nothing left. But the will hadn't been read yet, and that old woman in that casket had been waiting 30 years to protect her granddaughter from people exactly like them. Georgia heat don't ask permission. It just shows up and sits on you like it owns you. And on this particular afternoon in late August, the sun pressed down hard on a hillside cemetery outside of Atlanta, where 150 people had gathered to say goodbye to one of the quietest women any of them had ever known. The grass was a deep, tired green. The red Georgia clay around the open grave was dark and heavy. White lilies had been arranged in careful lines along both sides of the casket, and somewhere in the distance, a single bird was singing like it didn't know what day it was. Her name was Nadia Ruth Coleman Banks, 34 years old, standing near the back of the gathering because by the time she arrived, every front seat had already been taken, including the seat that belonged to her by every right that mattered. She wore a simple black dress that she'd bought 3 years ago for a work event and never imagined she'd wear to this. Her eyes were red from 3 days of not sleeping, but they were dry. She had cried everything out in private, the way her grandmother had always taught her. She stood straight, shoulders back, holding a single white rose against her chest, the same kind of white rose her grandmother had grown in her front yard every summer for as long as Nadia could remember. She had come alone. That was the first thing people noticed. Her husband Leon had called that morning and told her he was going to pick up his mother and would meet her there. She had said okay. She had learned somewhere across 5 years of marriage that saying okay was easier than the conversation that followed when she said anything else. Leon was already there when she arrived. He was standing near the front with his mother Gloria on one side and his co-worker Charisse on the other, and the three of them looked like they had arrived together, which they had. Gloria was 62 years old and dressed like she was the one accepting condolences. Heavy gold earrings, a wide-brimmed hat, a black dress that cost more than the flowers. She had the posture of a woman who believed she was the most important person in any room she walked into, and today she had decided a cemetery counted as a room. Nadia took her place standing at the edge of the crowd. She didn't fight for a seat. She just stood and looked at the casket, and the casket was the only thing that made sense to her right now. Inside that box was the woman who had raised her, the woman who had taught her everything, the woman who had looked at her with a kind of love that never needed explaining. And now she was gone, and somehow Nadia had to figure out how to keep breathing in a world that didn't have her in it anymore. The pastor began speaking. He talked about Grandma Ruth the way pastors talk about everybody, with warmth and general words that could have described almost anyone. Nadia listened and thought about specific things, the way her grandmother hummed while she cooked, the way she pressed her lips together when she was thinking hard about something, the way her hands felt, dry and warm and sure, when she held Nadia's face and looked at her like she was seeing something worth seeing. Gloria's voice cut through her thoughts like a screen door slamming. It wasn't loud enough to stop the service, but it was loud enough for the 8 or 10 people standing nearby to hear. She leaned toward the woman next to her and said clearly that it was a shame some people only showed up when there was something to gain. She said some people hadn't been around nearly enough while the old woman was living. She said it was interesting how grief could bring out the performers. Heads turned, eyes found Nadia. Nadia kept her gaze on the casket. Leon was standing 4 feet away from her. He heard it. He looked at the ground. Charisse was standing beside Leon, close enough that their arms touched. She was wearing perfume that Nadia could smell from where she stood, which was too much perfume for a funeral and not enough shame for a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. When Nadia glanced in their direction, Charisse was looking straight ahead, but she was touching Leon's arm, and Leon was letting her. The service moved toward its end. The pastor invited those who wished to step forward and place flowers on the casket before it was lowered. People moved slowly, one or two at a time, dropping roses and stepping back. Nadia waited. She wanted to go last. She wanted one moment alone at the edge of that grave, without anyone watching or crowding or performing their sadness next to her. She moved forward when most people had stepped back. She was maybe 6 feet from the open grave when Gloria stepped directly into her path. Not around her, into her. Like she didn't see her except her eyes were open and she was looking right at Nadia. For 1 second, the two women stood face to face. Gloria's expression was blank in the particular way that faces go blank when someone has decided what they're about to do and is past the point of reconsidering. Nadia held her white rose. She opened her mouth to say something. She wasn't sure what. Maybe just excuse me, maybe just please. And then Gloria's hands came forward and she shoved her. Not a brush, not a stumble, a shove. Deliberate and sudden, using both hands, putting her whole meaning into it. Nadia didn't have time to catch herself. She went forward, hit the edge of the grave, and fell in. She landed hard on top of the casket. The white rose crushed beneath her, red Georgia clay smearing across her dress, and her hands, and her face. The sound she made when she landed wasn't words. It was just breath, the sound of air being knocked out of a person. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed. 2 women near the front started crying. Children were pulled behind their mothers. One man called out her name. Another man started moving toward the grave. Leon stood exactly where he was. He looked at her, looked directly down into the grave at his wife lying on top of his grandmother-in-law's casket. And then he looked away. He reached up and adjusted his tie. He adjusted his tie the way a man adjusts his tie when a waiter brings him the wrong order, like it was a minor inconvenience. Like what had just happened was something he was going to have to manage around. Charisse put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, but there was something behind them, something small and satisfied, that she wasn't quite fast enough to hide. 2 men from the funeral home came quickly and reached down and helped Nadia up. They were professional and gentle, and they kept their voices low, asking her if she was hurt, if she could stand. She could stand. She stood. She was covered in red clay. Her dress was ruined. The white rose was crushed flat. She held what was left of it in her hand, and she looked down at it for a moment. Then she looked up. Gloria said loudly, to no one and to everyone, that goodness gracious, she should have been more careful up near the edge like that. The crowd heard it. Some people looked away. Some looked at Nadia with sorrow too heavy to carry. One older woman in the 3rd row closed her eyes. Nadia looked at Leon. Leon looked at the ground. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She stood there in the Georgia heat with red clay on her black dress and the crushed white rose in her hand. And she looked at the man she had married, and something inside her, something that had been bending for a long time, finally went completely, permanently still. At the very back of the crowd, near a row of oak trees, a man in a dark suit stood apart from the mourners. He was maybe 58, 60 years old, silver at his temples, a leather briefcase at his side. He wasn't crying. He wasn't praying. He was watching. He had been watching since the beginning. And when Nadia climbed out of that grave, his expression didn't change. But something in his eyes did. Something that looked like the quiet before a verdict gets read. Go back 20 years. Go back to Alabama, to a small house at the end of a red dirt road, where a little girl sat on a porch and watched the evening settle in over the trees. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside. Screen door with a small tier near the bottom. A garden along the side of the house that was more abundant than the house itself. Collard greens and tomatoes and marigolds, and those white roses running along the fence like they owned it. A kitchen where something was always warm, a radio playing something slow and sure. Nadia was 14 the summer she came home from school crying, not crying the way children cry about small things, crying the way children cry when something lands on them that they feel like they're going to carry for the rest of their life. Some girls at school had laughed at her shoes, called her poor, said her clothes looked like they came from a garbage bag. They had said it loudly, and they had said it in front of people, and Nadia had held herself together long enough to get off the school bus and walk up that dirt road and reach the porch, and then she had come apart. Grandma Ruth heard her before she saw her. She came out through the screen door and she sat down on the porch steps, and she pulled Nadia down beside her, and she just held her for a while, didn't say anything, didn't rush her, just let her cry until the crying was done. Then she stood up and went inside and came back with something in her hand. It was a small gold pendant on a thin chain, simple oval shape, not flashy. On the back, engraved in small letters, was the letter R. It was worn smooth the way things get when they've been held for a long time. Ruth had worn it herself for 30 years. Now she put it around her granddaughter's neck and fastened the clasp herself, taking her time, making sure it was right. Nadia looked down at it. She asked what it was for. 14-year-old Nadia didn't understand what that meant. She thought her grandmother was just being comforting the way grandmothers were. She held the pendant in her fingers and felt the warmth that had been living in it. And she felt, somehow, safe. She didn't know yet. She wouldn't know for a long time. What she knew was the love. She knew the kitchen table where her grandmother made her sit and read, not storybooks, but real things, lease agreements, deeds, simple contracts. Ruth would put a document in front of her and say, "Tell me what this means in plain language." Nadia would stumble through it at first, but Ruth was patient and she kept coming back to it until reading the small print felt natural, felt like something her mind was built for. Other kids were watching television. Nadia was learning that the law was just a language, and if you learned the language, nobody could trick you with it. She knew the Sunday mornings when her grandmother put on her good dress and went not to church, but to the county courthouse, where she sat in the back of whatever proceedings were open to the public and watched and listened. She brought Nadia sometimes, said she wanted her to see how things worked, said the world had systems and systems had rules, and the people who understood the rules were not the ones who got swallowed by them. She knew the way her grandmother spoke about money, never loudly, never casually. Ruth treated money the way serious people treat serious things, with attention, with respect, and without showing it off to anybody who didn't need to know. She told Nadia that the loudest people in a room are almost never the richest. She told her that real wealth moved quiet and moved patient, and only showed itself when it absolutely had to. Nadia grew up and went to college and came back changed, but still herself, still soft at the center, still the kind of woman who stopped to help people and remembered birthdays and cried at movies and held space for other people's pain. Her grandmother's discipline had not made her hard. It had made her steady. There is a difference, and the difference matters. She met Leon at 27. He was handsome and charming and attentive in the beginning, the way men can be when they're trying. He made her laugh. He made her feel seen. She introduced him to her grandmother, and Grandma Ruth shook his hand and looked at him for a long moment and said very little. Nadia had taken that silence for acceptance. She had been wrong about what kind of silence it was. She was 29 when they got married. She was wearing the gold pendant under her wedding dress, right at her collarbone, where it always was. The house Nadia came home to after the funeral was quiet, in a way that felt different from peaceful. Leon moved around it like he was avoiding something he couldn't name. He said he was giving her space to grieve. He said it gently, reasonably, and then he went into the other room and closed the door, and his phone stayed face down on the counter every time he set it down. She noticed. She had always noticed things. She had been noticing things for years and talking herself out of what she noticed, because the alternative, the full meaning of what she was seeing, was something she hadn't been ready to sit with. 3 days after the funeral, she was in the kitchen making tea. She didn't plan to drink when she heard his phone ring from the counter. He had left it there when he went to get something from the garage. She looked at the screen on reflex. It was his mother. That wasn't unusual. But the call log beneath it showed that his mother had called 11 times in the past 4 days, and he had answered every one. Not once had Gloria called to ask how Nadia was doing. Not once. The tea went cold. Nadia carried it to the window and stood there looking at the backyard. That same week, a woman from their church found her after Sunday service and pulled her gently aside and told her something she clearly didn't want to be carrying. She said she'd heard some things being said at a gathering at someone's house, she wouldn't say whose, about Nadia and her grandmother. Said she'd heard that Nadia had been estranged from the old woman. Said she'd heard that Ruth had died disappointed in the granddaughter she'd poured her life into. Said these things were being said with confidence, with detail, with the kind of specificity that makes people believe. Nadia thanked her. She went home. She sat at the kitchen table, the same kind of kitchen table her grandmother used to put contracts on and say, "Tell me what this means." And she sat there for a long time. She brought it to Leon that evening. She told him quietly and clearly what was being said and who she believed was saying it. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just told him, and then she waited. Leon sighed. He said his mother meant well. He said Nadia needed to understand that his mother came from a different generation and didn't always say things the right way. He said maybe Nadia was too sensitive right now because of the grief. He said she needed to let it go. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said goodnight, and she went to bed. She did not let it go. A Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the funeral. Nadia was coming out of a dry cleaner downtown when she remembered she had to return something, a book she'd borrowed months ago from a colleague who worked near the restaurant where Leon said he was having lunch. She walked the 3 blocks. She pulled open the door of the restaurant and let the cool air hit her face, and she stood in the entrance, letting her eyes adjust. She saw them before they saw her. Corner table. Leon in the middle, relaxed, leaning back the way he only leaned when he was comfortable. Gloria on his left in another outfit that cost too much. Charisse on his right, sitting close. On the table in front of them, next to the bread basket and the water glasses, was a real estate brochure. The glossy kind. Pictures of a house on the front. A nice house, a new house. A house that wasn't the one Leon and Nadia currently lived in together. They were laughing. Gloria said something and pointed at a page in the brochure, and Charisse nodded, and Leon smiled, and the 3 of them looked like a family planning something. They did not see Nadia. She stood at the entrance for 30 full seconds. She counted them the way you count seconds, when something is rearranging itself permanently inside you and you want to make sure you remember exactly how it felt. Then she turned around and walked back out onto the street. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 40 minutes, and then she cried. Not the quiet kind of crying she'd been doing since her grandmother passed, but a deep, wrenching, ugly kind of crying that came from somewhere below sadness. It came from clarity, from seeing the whole picture, every piece of it, and not being able to pretend anymore that the pieces didn't fit together the way they did. She cried until there was nothing left to cry. Then she wiped her face. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror the way her grandmother used to make her look at herself when she was a girl who'd been knocked down, Straight on, no looking away. She went home. That night she took off her wedding ring. She didn't make a speech about it. She didn't leave it somewhere dramatic or throw it at anyone. She set it on the bathroom counter gently, the way you set something down when you know you're done with it, but you're not angry. Just finished. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. Then she reached up and touched the gold pendant at her throat. There was something in her face now that hadn't been there before. Not hardness, not anger, something quieter than both of those things. Something that looked like what Grandma Ruth's face had looked like when she was about to show Nadia something important and was waiting for the right moment. What Nadia didn't know yet was that the man with the briefcase had called the house twice. Leon had answered both times. He had told Nadia afterward that it was a telemarketer. He had deleted both voicemails. But the second time, Nadia had been close enough to the phone when it rang that before Leon picked up, she had heard 3 seconds of the automated intro. And in those 3 seconds, she had heard 2 words clearly before the call was answered, and the voice was gone. The estate. She held those 2 words in the same careful place she'd been holding everything else, and she waited. The law offices of Warren, Hollins, and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta, where the elevator opened directly into a lobby with marble floors and tall windows, and the particular kind of silence that money buys intentionally. This was not the kind of office where people came to handle small things. The quality of the furniture alone told you that what happened here had weight. Nadia arrived first. She wore a simple black dress, a different one from the funeral. The gold pendant was at her throat. Her face was clean and still, and she sat in the chair at the far end of the conference table and folded her hands and waited. Leon arrived with Gloria. Charisse walked in behind them, and the audacity of that, bringing his co-worker, this woman, to the reading of his wife's grandmother's will, was so brazen it had its own kind of language. Gloria had clearly told him to bring her, and he had done what he always did with his mother's instructions. He had not questioned it. Gloria was dressed again like she was winning something. She looked around the conference room with an appraiser's eye, taking in the size of it, the quality of the table, the view from the windows. Something about the room made her sit up straighter, made her smile the small smile of a woman who believes she is finally being placed where she belongs. 2 distant relatives of Grandma Ruth sat across the table. A nephew from Mississippi who hadn't visited in years. A cousin from Florida who looked nervous and kept checking his watch. Attorney Warren entered last. He was the man with the briefcase from the cemetery. He set it on the table and opened it and removed a bound document and several sealed envelopes. He greeted everyone by name, professionally, with no warmth and no coldness. He had done this many times. He sat down, settled his glasses, and began. Leon hadn't looked directly at Nadia since they walked in. He was sitting 2 seats away from her, and the space between those 2 seats felt like a geography. Warren read through the preliminary language the way lawyers read it, steadily, without drama, the way people who understand that the words themselves are the drama don't feel the need to perform around them. He covered the declarations, the attestations, the legal architecture of the document. Gloria kept nodding slightly, which was the nod of someone who is waiting to hear their name. Then Warren read the asset summary. He read it clearly and without pausing. He listed the land holdings. 5 southern states, hundreds of acres, some of it commercial, some of it agricultural, all of it owned outright without a mortgage on a single acre of it. He listed the commercial real estate holdings, buildings in Atlanta, in Birmingham, in Charlotte, in Nashville. He listed the silent equity stakes, 3 major companies where Grandma Ruth's name appeared in shareholder documents that nobody outside those boardrooms had ever thought to look at. He listed the private investment portfolio, assembled across 4 decades, quietly compounding, quietly growing in structures so legally clean that 3 different attorneys had spent the past 14 months organizing them. He listed the liquid accounts. Then he read the total, $18.2 billion. The room did not react the way rooms react in movies. Nobody gasped loudly. Nobody stood up. What happened was something more complete and more honest than that. The room went silent in the way that rooms go silent when the air itself changes, when something enters the space that is too big for regular breathing, and everyone present has to take a moment just to stay upright. Gloria made a sound. It started like a word and dissolved into something that wasn't. Leon's jaw opened. It did not close. The Mississippi nephew looked at the Florida cousin. The Florida cousin looked at the table. Charisse looked at Leon. And Leon, for one revealing moment, looked at the ceiling the way a man looks at the ceiling when the floor has disappeared under him. Warren let the number exist in the room for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he turned the page. He read the distribution clause. The entirety of the estate, all assets, all holdings, all properties, all liquid accounts, was to be transferred in full to one person. The name on the document was Nadia Ruth Coleman Banks. No conditions, no challenges built in, no shared distribution, no trust committee, no waiting period, no percentage to any other living relative. Everything, to her, effective upon the completion of the reading. Then Warren set down the document and looked over his glasses at Nadia. He told her that her grandmother had updated the will 14 months ago and had made certain that every legal protection available had been applied and witnessed across multiple sessions over several years. He told her that there was also a personal letter. He slid a cream-colored envelope down the length of the table. Every eye in the room watched it travel. Nadia reached out and picked it up. She broke the seal slowly. She unfolded the letter inside, 3 pages, handwritten, in the careful script of a woman who had thought long and hard about every word before she wrote it, and she read it. She read it the way her grandmother had taught her to read important things. Slowly, completely, without rushing toward the conclusion. The room sat in silence while she read, and nobody spoke, because the room understood, even Gloria understood, that this moment did not belong to any of them. When she finished, she folded the letter with both hands. She tucked it into her purse. She sat for a moment with her eyes on the table. Then she stood up. She looked at Gloria first, long enough for Gloria to understand what was in that look, which was nothing threatening and nothing cruel. Just the look of a woman who had finally stopped pretending she didn't see what was directly in front of her. Then she looked at Charisse, who dropped her eyes immediately. Then she looked at Leon. She looked at her husband for a long, still, final moment. Then she said it, quietly, not triumphantly, just truly. She said, she knew. She always knew. That's why she never told any of you. She picked up her purse and walked toward the door. Warren cleared his throat. He had one more thing. He mentioned, almost in passing, the way lawyers mention things that are anything but passing, that among the property holdings he had not yet detailed was the mortgage on a residential property in Buckhead, the property where Leon and Nadia currently resided together. He noted that 3 years ago, Grandma Ruth had quietly purchased that mortgage outright. He noted that the deed of the property had been transferred into Nadia's name 18 months ago without any change to the residence or the routine of the household. Leon had been living in his wife's house. His name was not on the deed, had never been on the deed. He hadn't known. Warren delivered this information the same way he delivered everything, with the calm precision of a man who has learned that facts do not require decoration. Nadia paused at the door. Her back was to the room. She didn't turn around. She said it simply. "You have 30 days." Then she walked out. A man cannot lose what he never actually had, but he can spend years believing he had it and organizing his whole life around that belief. And when the belief collapses, the life collapses with it. That is what happened to Leon in the weeks that followed, and watching it was not satisfying the way revenge stories pretend to be satisfying. It was just the particular sadness of watching someone face the full cost of who they chose to be. His finances unraveled fast once Nadia's name was removed from anything that had been shared between them. She had been quiet about her contributions the way her grandmother had been quiet about everything important, which meant Leon had been benefiting from things he hadn't examined closely enough to understand. 2 bank accounts that had been carrying more of the household weight than he knew. A credit line that was in both their names and had been maintained by her consistency. Insurance structures attached to her employment. When those things separated, what remained on Leon's side was considerably less than he had believed himself to be standing on. The new house, the one in the brochure, the one Gloria had been laughing about over bread baskets and lunch orders, quietly ceased to be a possibility. The financial advisor Gloria had already consulted called Leon back for a second meeting, and the second meeting had a different tone than the first. Leon stopped returning his mother's calls for almost a full week, which was the first independent decision he had made in their relationship in a very long time, even if it was a small one and even if it came too late. He called Nadia. She didn't answer. He texted. She didn't respond. He went to the house, her house, though he still thought of it as theirs, on a Thursday evening with flowers that he had clearly bought from a gas station because he'd had the intention and none of the follow-through that a real plan would have required. Nadia came to the door. She opened it the distance of a conversation and no further. He said her name. He had flowers in his hand. He looked like a man who had only just now, standing on the porch of the house he'd lost, arrived at the understanding of what he had thrown away, and the tragedy of that wasn't lost on either of them. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said to him what she had been knowing for a while and hadn't said out loud until now. She said he had watched his mother push her into her grandmother's grave, and he had fixed his tie and looked away. She said that was the whole sentence. That was the whole story. Everything that needed to be understood about what they had been and what they were now was contained in that one moment at that cemetery on that red clay hillside in the Georgia heat. Then she closed the door. Gloria's fall was slower and louder and more public, which matched who she was. The community found out about the will the way communities find out about everything, through the people who were in the room talking to the people who weren't, and those people talking to the people who came after that. Word traveled, and as it traveled, people began doing the arithmetic on everything they'd been told in the weeks since the funeral. The things Gloria had said about Nadia at gatherings and at church, the estrangement that wasn't true, the disappointment that Grandma Ruth never felt, the portrait of a granddaughter who hadn't shown up, painted carefully and strategically by a woman who showed up at that old woman's funeral and shoved that granddaughter into the grave. The story changed shape in people's minds. The women who had cooled toward Nadia after Gloria's whisper campaign began warming back. The men who had nodded along in social settings began looking at the floor when Gloria came around. The particular kind of social standing that Gloria had spent decades constructing, based entirely on being seen, on being heard, on being the loudest person in whatever room she was in, began coming apart at the seams in the quiet, irreversible way that certain things come apart when the truth gets out. She contacted Warren's office trying to contest the will. She had spoken to a lawyer of her own, she said. She had questions about the process. She had concerns about the document's validity. Warren informed her with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything that the document had been constructed with the specific anticipation that challenges might be attempted, that it had been witnessed and reinforced and legally structured across multiple years and multiple sessions, precisely because Grandma Ruth had understood people well enough to know what some of them would try. There was nothing to contest. There was no door in the document that wasn't locked, and the locks had been installed by a woman who had been preparing for 30 years. Gloria went home. Cherise's calculation resolved the way calculations do when the numbers change. She had been positioning herself in Leon's life as something permanent, something that would be there when the marriage ended, which she had been treating as an inevitability she was helping along. When she looked at the reality of Leon without Nadia, without the financial architecture that Nadia's presence had quietly built around their shared life, without the house, without the income structure, without any of the stability that Cherise had mistaken for his stability, the positioning stopped making sense. She transferred to a different department at work within a month. She stopped answering his messages within a week after that. Leon didn't hear her voice again. He was alone, completely, simply, entirely alone. Sitting in a house he had 30 days to leave, in a life he had 30 years to build and chose to dismantle instead, with nothing waiting for him on the other side except the truth about who he had been. Early morning is different in a cemetery than late afternoon. The heat hadn't arrived yet. The grass was wet with dew, and the air had a particular stillness to it, the kind that feels like the earth is breathing slowly on purpose. The oak trees at the back of the hillside were soft and still. The birds were awake, but not loud. Everything was the color of beginning. Nadia came alone. She walked the familiar path between the rows until she reached the headstone she had ordered 2 weeks after the reading of the will. Black granite, polished clean, carved with her grandmother's full name and the years of her life, and below those, the only other words Nadia had asked them to put there. She moved quiet. She moved patient. She moved certain. Nadia knelt on the wet grass, and she placed a single white rose against the base of the stone. Not a crushed rose, a whole one. She had gone to a proper florist early that morning and chosen it herself, taking her time, picking the one that was the most open and the most full, the one that looked the most like the roses from the fence along the side of her grandmother's old Alabama house. She stayed there for a while. The morning kept being morning around her. A bird somewhere decided to sing. The dew on the grass caught the early light and made it mean something. She touched the gold pendant at her throat, the one with the R on the back, worn smooth from decades of hands. Her grandmother's hands first, her own hands after. She didn't speak out loud, but inside her, in the voice she used when it was just her, she said what had been sitting in her chest since the day she read that letter. She said, "You built all of that so quietly. 40 years of patience. 40 years of moving the way you always told me to move. You did it so that when they finally showed me who they were, you'd already made sure I'd be okay. I understand now. You weren't just leaving me money. You were leaving me the proof that I was worth protecting, that the woman they laughed at and lied about and shoved into the ground, she was worth 40 years of love." She was quiet for a while after that. Then she stood up. She straightened her dress. She looked at the headstone one more time, with the expression of someone who isn't saying goodbye because they're not going anywhere, because the love they carry doesn't have a leaving date. Then she turned and walked back across the wet grass toward the morning. She looked different, not harder. Nadia had never become hard because hard was not the thing she was made for. She looked settled. She looked the way a woman looks when she has finally completely set down the weight she was never supposed to be carrying in the first place, when she has stopped bending herself into shapes Other people needed her to be and stood back up to her full height and found, to no great surprise but to enormous relief, that her full height was more than enough. The oak trees were still. The bird was still singing. The morning light came across the cemetery in long gold lines, the way light moves when it's not in a hurry and doesn't have to be, and it found her there and it stayed on her. She didn't scream, she didn't beg, she didn't fight back in the dirt. She simply waited, because her grandmother had already fought that battle 40 years before she was even born. If you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe, because we tell these stories for the people who lived them. We'll see you in the next one.